Hello, everyone, and welcome back to ACRO's Good Clinical Podcast. I'm your host, Sophia McLeod, and today I have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Tala Fakhouri, Associate Director for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence Policy at the FDA, and Stephen Pyke, Chief Clinical Data and Digital Officer at Parexel. If their titles weren't enough of a clue, Tala and Stephen are here talking all things AI and drug development. We'll get into FDA's thinking around AI used in new submissions, how the industry is looking at the global regulatory landscape, and do a bit of a deeper dive into concepts like transparency and explainability. Enjoy! Well, I am very lucky to be joined by Tala and Stephen today to talk about artificial intelligence and machine learning in drug development, AI/ML. I'm probably going to not be doing the whole mouthful for the rest of the podcast, but thank you both for joining me. I'm really excited for this episode today. I think loyal listeners of the podcast will remember Stephen from last season when he was joined by Lisa Moneymaker from SAMA, but this time around we've got Tala with us from the FDA to help us gain a bit of the regulator perspective as well. I think that's going to be really interesting for me and for our listeners. So like I said, very lucky to have you both on GCP. We may as well just get into it. Stephen, I think maybe we'll start with you. Was hoping you could tell us a little bit about how you're thinking about AI being used to advance clinical drug development, maybe provide us with a few examples of ways that AI is currently being used and might be used in the future. And then maybe, Tala, if we could have you speak to this in terms of what FDA is seeing as far as what AI tools are being used in new submissions, as much as you can share. But yeah, Stephen, if you want to kick us off, that'd be great.
Yeah, and let me begin by saying what a pleasure it is to be back with you again, Sophia, and also, Tala, pleasure to have the chance to have a conversation with you. I'll begin by saying I think what's been really striking with AI, and indeed since the conversation we had last year, is how rapidly things have moved on. And there's a real sense, I think, to your question, that if we had any doubts before, surely no one can have any doubts today that AI has the ability to touch every part of the drug development life cycle. Historically, of course, we've seen it in areas where the opportunity was enormous because the risks were so high, the failure rates were so high, like drug discovery, like lead optimization in the sort of choice of molecule. In the clinical space, though, we've really seen some real encroachment into that space in a really helpful, positive way, I think. And just to call out a few examples, some that sort of predate generative AI, some very obviously dependent on generative AI. I mean, one of the most long-standing areas for me, and quite a significant one, is around post-marketing surveillance and pharmacovigilance, and the ability of AI to really help us with high-volume intake, careful, reliable, systematic analysis of that data, and then decision support, enabling human beings, human experts to work more efficiently. So pharmacovigilance would be a key area which has actually been around for a number of years now, where I think we've developed some really nice understanding of how to use the technology and use it well. Similarly, I think in the image analysis space, and my organization works with other companies who specialize in this, but AI support for reads of whether it's X-rays or CT scans or ECGs, I think, again, now very well advanced in terms of how to harness that technology in that space. I think one that's really gaining ground, and I think in a really powerful way, is design optimization and the sort of study designs and the way that we think about it clearly from a scientific perspective, the ability for AI to digest huge volumes of the literature and published information, and you interrogate that and then offer insights based on that data as they apply to a new protocol. But of course, there's an operational angle as well, which is equally pertinent, and we're seeing some progress there. And then there's myriad just plain out-of-the-box generative AI applications through content generation, through knowledge access and retrieval, and so on. So, sort of back office stuff, if you like, the ability for those conducting clinical studies just to move more rapidly. And therefore, we hope through that gain in efficiency, we see more drugs coming through the pipeline as a consequence. But I mean, just a few. But I think I'd go back to what I said at the beginning. For my money, there's probably no part of what we do that can't be touched by AI, so long as we remember that it's a support to humans.
Couldn't agree more with what Stephen said, and thank you for having me too. last year, we published a landscape analysis looking at FDA's experience with regulatory submissions that have AI ML components. And similarly, we've seen applications across the spectrum, even in areas where FDA traditionally would not, look at the specific application, like in discovery. But it was just an expression of excitement, I think, on the sponsor side that AI was used in discovery. So whether that's, using AI to predict the folding or binding of a protein or to identify the best target for a clinical trial. Most of what we've seen has been in clinical research, but I do agree that AI in pharmacovigilance, in post-market safety surveillance is also a huge use case. For clinical research, specifically, what we've seen on our end includes things, like the clinical decision support type of applications of machine learning, where you might be using an algorithm to assist the clinical investigator in stratifying patients to different dosing regimen. Or there are applications of AI as part of a real-world analysis, real-world data analysis. A large application is also the use of digital health technologies in a clinical trial where that DHT is AI enabled. We expect that all of these uses across the spectrum, and if done responsibly, will actually increase the efficiency, accelerate the steps that are required to get a drug on the market. So the applications are wide across the spectrum. To date, we've received over 300 submissions with AI ML components, and we expect that number to only increase over time, not just the number, but also the complexity of the application of the technology. So now we're seeing certain submissions with LLM, large language model components. We expect to also see generative AI types of applications in clinical research. And some of the ways that could be used is to increase the efficiency, the statistical efficiency of a trial, right? Where you could do that in multiple different ways, but one of them is analytics, so creating more efficient statistical analyses, but you can also imagine having more accurate digital endpoints. So if you're using a DHT, an AI-enabled DHT, you would get more accurate, comprehensive measures on participants that would require you then to have a smaller number of participants in a trial. So you would be increasing efficiency.
Yeah, and Tala, I know you can't talk, in specifics, especially when FDA is developing guidance and you're sort of in that process. But can you give us a general sense of, how, whether what you're seeing in submissions or what you're hearing from industry and academia and from patients, the entire stakeholder class, how that's informing how FDA is thinking about the use of AI and ML in drug development as we move forward?
Sure. So first, I want to just start by saying that our standards, our evidentiary standards, do not change if you're using a new technology, which means the rigor will be the same, right? So it's not that we would accept less rigorous types of analyses and studies just because you're using a technology, whether it is for DHTs, if it's for RWE, or if it's for AI, it's the same. What we hear, though, from sponsors, from CROs, from folks in academia, or even smaller biotech companies, is the need for us to articulate what we mean by a risk-based approach for AI use in drug development. And this is what we hope to articulate in the draft guidance that we're publishing later this year. And I want to emphasize draft, right? It's draft guidance. We really want to receive input from the community. This is a rapidly evolving area, and we expect to do this with a lot of information and feedback from the practitioners, from the sponsors who are actually using this technology. That's kind of where this responsive regulation and FDA's risk-based approach for all of these technologies come from.
Yeah, and Stephen, you're in the UK. Our industry is global. Obviously, FDA is doing a lot of work on this, but we're seeing regulatory and legislative work from other agencies and other bodies outside of the US. How do you think about, some of that global comparison?
A great question. And I think it's been really interesting now clearly all of the major global regulators are actively working on this whole question of, so how do we respond to the emergence of AI? They can all see, I'm sure, that it's coming fast into the sort of space where the regulators have significant accountability to ensure that the medicines are delivered that are safe, high quality, and efficacious. So they're all looking at it. The MHRA, the UK regulator, most recently issued, I think it was a white paper, is probably best described as, and they tackle a number of topics, but in them is so what does all of this mean in terms of the way we operate? In fact, what it says, and it's quite brief, but what it says in essence is what Tala said a moment ago. What we care about when we look at submissions with a review to potentially approving them for use with patients is unchanged, and that will remain true regardless. So, and then the EMA, in a much lengthier treatment of the issue, sort of said the same thing, I think. All existing standards and requirements stand. What the EMA did, which I think was somewhat helpful for many of us in the industry, was, in essence, to, in quite fine detail, say these are the areas that we have questions, concerns, where we want to be reassured if you present us with an AI-enabled submission of some description. So we start to get a sense of things like their desire for transparency, their desire for a simpler model where a simpler model will suffice rather than a more complex model, understandable concerns about the potential for bias, and that leading to error in the use of AI-enabled technologies. And of course, ultimately, they're concerned for the safety of the patient. That obviously uppermost in all our minds. So on the one hand, the MHRA, sort of restatement of what's always been true remains true. The EMA is saying the same, but with a lot more granularity. We look forward to seeing what the FDA has to say on the subject. I guess the last thing I would say, though, is, and I'm sure this is a view that many of us would support, life is easier when you're an organization which is thinking about a global patient population, when the regulators have more convergent rather than more divergent positions. And whilst we're very early in the journey, of course, that's our great hope, is that and I will, of course, acknowledge and support the work that's already been done, notably with the FDA very much striving to set up both opportunities for regulators to share perspectives, but also published work plans around what they're doing in AI and how they're exploring this area. I think that's incredibly helpful as well. So yeah, look, it's early in the journey, but positive signs so far, a lot still to learn.
Yeah, I think even though there aren't any guidelines or guidances on AI in drug development yet, if you look at the EMA reflection paper that was published in 2023, and the two discussion papers from the FDA on AI, one was a general discussion paper across all stages of drug development, and the other was specific to manufacturing. If you look at these papers and the feedback received, there are so many similarities. And I think our approach will probably, I can't predict the future, but our approach will be similar to the extent possible, considering that there are other regulations, for example, the EU AI Act, that may play a different role. We're going to see how all of that unfolds. But when you talked about the specifics in the EMA reflections paper, these are the same themes that we've seen in responses from industry to our discussion paper. If I could just summarize the themes, right? First, what is FDA's oversight? What exactly you will be regulating when it comes to AI? The second theme that emerged is, what do you mean by transparency exactly? What is the level of documentation that would be required for us to be transparent on how the technology is being used? Can you articulate exactly what you mean by risk-based approach? There were some questions about things like explainability, and sometimes I think that term gets mixed up with transparency. Explainability and transparency are related. They're not the same concept. So then we've also received many comments about the need to ensure global harmonization of AI regulation, and to the extent possible, try to be consistent with some of the guidance and documentation that has been developed by our devices colleagues. So for FDA, that would be CDRH. Whenever we have conversations with global regulators, and we've had many to date, I think there is a similar approach right now between many of the regulators as it relates to AI use in drug development. So I'm very hopeful that once we have the first stage of guidances and guidelines issued, then the next step would be through an ICH guideline to harmonize anything that's already out there on the use of AI in drug development. And if I could pause here just for a moment, this is something that I think is very important, this issue of explainability and transparency. When we think about transparency from our experience at the FDA right now and the over 300 submissions that we've received, it's really about methodological transparency. So tell me, how did you develop your model? What data did you use to develop the model? We've addressed similar issues with the RWE program, where we say things like your data should be fit for use. Is the data used to train these models really reflecting how you intend to deploy it in a specific context of use? Does it include all the important variables? Is it representative of what you're trying to simulate or predict? What amount of missing data is there? Tell me why you chose that specific model and not something else. Something that we see a lot in submissions is this excitement around using complex models. Instead, you could go to the more parsimonious model. So instead of an LLM, an NLP would have been just fine. And it's easier for all of us to understand and interpret than an LLM. This is, to us, this is what we mean by methodological transparency, and it does not equate explainability, because inherently, for a lot of data-driven technology, explainability may be very difficult to achieve.
Yeah, Stephen, do you have any thoughts there? I know this explainability question is something our working group has talked about a lot.
Yes, indeed. And I was intrigued to see where Tala went with this whole notion of explainability, because of course, the more complex models, and let's just use LLMs as being one of the more complex models. There's a lot of active research around how do we show, what does explainability look like in that context, and how close to explainability can we get? And I think what research seems to be the stage we're at with the research at the moment is we can make some headway, but really we're a long way from being able to describe with any degree of certainty the relationship between the inputs and the outputs in a sort of complete case and on an exhaustive basis. We can see connections, we can see neurons light up, but we struggle to get a great deal beyond that. So, my sense here is there is clearly utility in more complex models. I think Tala's right. If simpler will suffice, simpler is preferred. Occam's razor, as has been the case for many, many years. But whether there would be an acceptability in a regulatory context of a non-explainable, more complex model, I think we'll only know when we have a case study to look at. But it's an intriguing question, which I think many of us are sort of very interested to see tested.
And this is where my answer, which never satisfies anyone, it depends, right? There are certain situations where explainable models will be preferable, right? If you're trying to establish causality, there may be more interest in using explainable models. But we have received applications where the models are unexplainable, and we've kind of allowed that use because, again, it depends on how the specific technology is being used. What is the role? What is the scope of AI modeling? And what is it used to answer? What is your study question that you're trying to achieve with AI use? So it depends.
Yeah, as always.
So we've kind of talked about this, the drug development life cycle is long. The process to get to new medicines is long, and there are a lot of steps along the way. It's quite a complex ecosystem. And I'm just wondering from both of you, how are you thinking about where we really are right now in terms of, in a meaningful way, integrating AI ML across the medicine's life cycle and where we're at today. Maybe, Stephen, do you want to kick us off and then Tala?
Yeah, I suppose I'll answer it in two parts. I think on the one hand, a lot of good work has been done to establish frameworks so that when organizations think about AI and how they're going to develop solutions for particular problems, that they do so in a sort of thoughtful way, that they're not just going about it haphazardly, willy-nilly. I mean, when all's said and done, these are significant investments for any organization, talent, expertise, technology itself. So I think companies have done, on the whole, as best I can tell, a nice job of recognizing that this needs handling thoughtfully, carefully, and a framework needs to guide the way that we develop solutions. And in doing so, I think there's some nice resources out there. And I was thinking about the NIST risk management framework for AI as an example. I know a number of organizations are implicitly or explicitly adopting that as sort of the sort of reference point for the way that they think about AI. And then in terms of progress of actually developing solutions themselves, I think there's this sort of, how can I describe it? In terms of generative AI, I think companies are moving as fast as they possibly can because the ease with which they can develop solutions. I mean, small incremental value solutions can be developed in weeks, and really high quality ones can be developed in weeks rather than years, which is what we may be more used to with technology. The sort of GPT type solutions, as they come in a sort of enterprise wrapper, but in essence out of the box, make building applications really straightforward. And so every organization that's sort of active in this area is progressing fast. And it's been very interesting talking to organizations about where they're focusing their efforts. And there's a remarkable congruence as you talk to one company or another, very similar areas of interest. So that's sort of the generative AI. I think in terms of the non-generative, the sort of, I'll call it classic AI, machine learning, deep learning, NLP, and so on. I think that my sense is there's been a spurt of investment and interest in those areas too, and perhaps spurred by the interest, the very serious interest in generative AI. And so we're seeing, again, more solutions, more interest in applications in those areas too. So, I would say in terms of where is the industry, I think we are in a state where there is serious investment going in across the board, where there's a very rapid evaluation, adoption, and implementation of solutions. And it's being done within I would say, from what I can tell, at least a very nice, well thought through framework. So I would say the short answer to your question, therefore, has to be actually we're in a very healthy place when it comes to thinking about and then getting the benefits from AI. But there's a long way still to go, without doubt.
And if I could add to that, and this is a great summary, Stephen, I think the low-hanging fruit is anywhere where automation can happen, right? This is where you can see this rapid, quick adoption. And where automation can happen, again, I'm going to bring up the AI-enabled DHT, where you're also using AI for analysis of that large amount of data, right? Or creating data sets where actually you're creating the linkages between the data and harmonizing the data using AI. Then you have the more specialized types of applications. And I want to say of the 300 submissions that we've received, I don't have the exact breakdown, but what I can tell you is the vast majority are actually traditional machine learning type of uses. But again, we do expect that we're going to see more generative AI and large language models and the complexity to change, because actually a lot of the submissions use hybrid models. So not even just, it would have a traditional statistical method in combination with machine learning or other types of AI. The other place where automation, and you could see that, right, where automating AI processes is also a huge thing, is the analysis of images, whether it's images from a CT scan, an MRI, an X-ray, these type of image analysis is also, to me, some sort of a low-hanging fruit. So anytime you're able to manage, sort, process large amount of information, this is where we see a lot of uses of AI. But what I expect to see over the next few years is more specialized uses of AI that are a little more unique, and use this what I keep calling, causal framework or causal inference using AI, which I'm very excited about. That's for me, from my perspective, and from FDA's experience of all the submissions that we've received.
Let me add one other comment, if I may, Sophia, because I'm reminded, just something that Tala said a moment ago, I'm reminded that there's an ecosystem around us. We're not just regulators, sponsors, CROs, whatever. There's also academic community, of course, and a key part of the unfolding story of AI. And, I think one of the great drivers of progress in this space is going to be, in particular, the relationship that academics are enabling between their interest in AI and their access to data. And of course, it's very easy to think, oh, GPT, generative pre-trained, it's sort of ready to go. There's nothing else to say. Why would I need data? But there are many applications for which additional data for further training, fine-tuning, is essential, and access to data to interrogate that data is also incredibly important. So, that relationship to deep, rich data sources that academics are enabling, coupled with their own personal and institutional interest in AI and AI development, I think is going to be, again, as is often the case with innovation, they will be a really powerful community helping drive what we do.
And this, you bring up, I'm going to digress a little bit more because you're bringing up a very important point. The ecosystem for AI is not your traditional, sponsor CRO only combination, right? You have a lot of the technology being developed and fine-tuned by academia, but also small biotech or even small technology companies that don't identify as biotech. A lot of the different players in the ecosystem have access to different strengths compared to one another. So, the sponsor has the experience with the FDA, for example, but a tech company or a person in academia may not have that experience with the regulator. Not just the access to data, access to domain expertise, access to all of these different resources. So I think all of us together, we need to have a different way of bringing all of these different players together. And I know that this was in the ACRO AI principles, the multidisciplinary expertise. This is also such an important topic, is making sure that we're bringing all the right people together in advancing that technology, and also hopefully developing multi-fluency also around AI use. So I know that I'm digressing, but this is a topic that is important to me just from all of the interactions that I have with AI practitioners. When you bring someone in from academia, it depends on whether they are trained as a physicist, an engineer, a data scientist, an epidemiologist, or a biostatistician, or a clinician. Similarly for CROs, similarly for sponsors, also for the regulators. We all talk about the same concepts and constructs using different terms and definitions. So for us to really accelerate the adoption of that technology, not only do we all have to collaborate together, we have to find a way to understand each other, even with, if I ask Stephen right now what verification validation means to you, it would probably mean something maybe slightly different from my interpretation of the terms verification and validation. If we talk to an engineer or if we talk to a biostatistician, they'll also come up with these different terms. If we want to accelerate the adoption of the technology, we have to understand each other. And this is where I'm seeing this block right now that's preventing the productive collaboration between different groups.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think, we talk a lot about collaboration in our industry for various things, but I think this one's a little different. Like you said, it's kind of what we're used to in terms of we know there are other stakeholders out there and we've got to work together, but how exactly we work together and listen to each other, I think is really interesting in the AI context. I appreciate the mention of the ACRO principles. I'm going to ask Stephen a question about that in a second, actually. So that tied in nicely. But Tala, I was hoping maybe just, I'm kind of curious from your perspective, what do you see as some of the most important things the drug development industry can be doing to ensure, I think we talk about this a lot, like ethical implementation of AI in clinical research? And then, like I said, Stephen, I've got a piggyback question for you, but Tala, I'll let you start here.
So with the ethical implementation, obviously that's the responsible use of the technology is critical, I think, to all of us, not just to the regulators. And what ethical AI means also is probably different depending on where you're using it in the drug development program, right? If it's secondary use of data, the ethical construct there might be different. Let's talk about informed consent. Let's talk about data provenance. Let's talk about IRBs, right? If you're using AI in the context of a clinical trial, I'm going to give you an example where the algorithm will inform the investigator on whether a patient should be monitored as an inpatient or an outpatient, depending on their baseline data and other variables that are used to construct that model. That patient would need to know if AI was the determinant of whether they received inpatient or outpatient after they received an investigational drug of interest. So it depends on where it's being used across the spectrum, but in totality, obviously, the technology has to be used responsibly. We do get asked, and this is actually something that we received as feedback, and it's in the public docket on the discussion paper. Do we need to mention AI use on the label? We also get these questions as it relates to doers. Obviously, this is different for AI-enabled medical devices, but these are all issues that we will need to address moving forward. I don't think that we've articulated that clearly, but partly because it's a rapidly evolving technology, but I think we're going to get there.
Yeah, and Stephen, sort of similar question, but with the lens of principle statements. Obviously, as Tala mentioned, thanks, Tala, we developed our principles last year, I guess it was. We released those, really trying to guide us on the responsible use of AI. And so just curious from you, Stephen, obviously you're a part of an industry group, you are in a coalition collaboration thing that we've got going on here at ACRO. How do you see these statements really helping to ensure that ethical implementation and kind of guiding us on this pathway?
Yeah, I guess I begin with a recognition that we are part of an industry which does something, in my view, truly noble. We help progress the discovery, the development, and then the delivery to patients of medicines which can be life transforming for them. But ultimately, also, that means we have a massive responsibility to do that well. And everything that we do touch and are part of in that endeavor, therefore, has to be done with the utmost care and quality. And so, if you like, the ACRO principles for me, we're nothing more than an extension of exactly the same line of thinking. It's a statement that says, as we sort of delve into this technology, which for many there's sort of a lack of familiarity. It's relatively, even though it's been around for 75 years, in principle at least, for many of us it's a new technology. But as we do so with care, with careful thought. And so, the principles really say things which I hope will be no surprise to anyone if they haven't read them, but it talks about the need to act responsibly, to be transparent when you're using AI, so that people who are exposed to an output from an AI technology know that it's from an AI technology, that we do all of this with human oversight, that we are clear where the accountability and ownership sits within an organization, so that if there's a problem, we know who to go to get redress. Legality and regulatory compliance are given, of course, data security and other dimensions. So, it's a sort of statement of things which I hope are utterly unsurprising, but in a sense, by saying it and saying it publicly and saying it at the start of the journey, I think it's about framing our intent with a public who could be forgiven for being a little bit anxious about AI. The public discourse around AI, let's be frank, isn't just about applications in medicine. It's about AI in their personal lives. And of course, we hear about deep fakes. It's about AI in biometric surveillance. And many people have anxieties about that, or even in warfare. So AI is being applied everywhere. And the average person may not necessarily understand the fine differences between the way different sectors operate and how they approach the use of AI. Autonomous AI, which we would never support in our sector, but which is used elsewhere. Human oversight being critical. So I think the statement really is about recognizing that there is a community, a public, whose confidence is absolutely critical for us to be able to operate as an industry. And it's a commitment to them first and foremost, in my mind, that this is what we promise, if you like, and this is what you can hold us to account for. These are the standards which we will meet. So, yeah, I mean, it's, as I said, it's in some ways an utterly unremarkable and unsurprising document, but I think it's critically important that we've been willing and able to collectively say so. This is what we stand by.
And this is a great answer, Steve. I'm glad that this is being recorded, because I think your answer really wonderfully captures how AI is being used in the work that we do. The benevolent use of AI, right? Without this malicious intent or what's called dual use. In fact, a lot of regulators, and not necessarily regulators of medical products, come to medical products regulators and say, you've been dealing with these types of applications for a while, and the uses there are for good causes. Can you tell us your thinking? Can you tell us how you've been approaching this issue? But again, it just shows you that we have been exposed to the use of this technology for many years now. And because our intent, both as regulators, but also for the industry, is to produce safe, effective, high quality drugs, we really have the structures and the frameworks in place to ensure that the technology is used responsibly. So just wanted to echo what you said.
Yeah, you've both mentioned patients a bit throughout our conversation. So I thought I'd maybe end with patients, because they, like you guys have said, they're really why we're doing the work we're doing. We're working with patients in mind. So obviously patients are going to be impacted, I think, by, the use of AI in the drug development process. So can both of you, Tala, maybe you go first. But just talk a little bit about what, patients can expect in terms of their impact and what they'll experience as we implement AI in the drug development process.
I think where we're hopeful is that safe, effective, high quality drugs will be produced, come out to the market faster, right? Because of all these increases in efficiencies along the way. But again, to echo what Stephen said earlier, we can only do that with transparency to the patients, because there is a lot of skepticism, and rightly so, around the use of the technology in everyday life. It is very important that we're very transparent about AI, when it was used, how it was used, and the reliance of the clinician on that technology, right? If you look specifically on the devices side, and our colleagues published the 10 guiding principles for good machine learning practice, they discuss transparency specifically, and they also highlight that what transparency means is not the same thing to all users. If the user is the regulator, transparency there is different from if it's the patient. So communicating to the patient specifically how AI might impact their health is critical and key. But I am hopeful that drugs will come out faster. We'll be able, specifically in certain diseases, like rare diseases, that we're going to see acceleration of the development of safe, effective drugs with the use of that technology.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think I'm very optimistic that this is a technology which has the capability to truly bring more medicines to market more quickly, and that has to be a good thing for patients. by and large, many of the applications of AI which will prove to be most successful, I suspect, will be sort of hidden behind the physician, because, as we've said already, the whole point of the way we think about AI in our sector is as an aid to support experts. And the physician obviously is one example of an expert, the interface, the trusted partner to the patient. And so the AI is really just a tool for the physician to help the patient in many cases make sure that they're managed effectively. That said, there will be some examples where they have direct contact with AI-enabled tools. And I read only this morning about an atrial fibrillation technology inbuilt into smartwatches, which I believe the FDA has just approved. And as an example, I suppose, of something we can now expect to be seeing in medical research, including clinical trials, of course. So there will be some instances like that. Whether the patients know that it's AI enabled is another matter, but they will, I guess, have direct contact. But I think in the main, it's going to be as an aid to the process by which we treat them. Their physician treats them, and then we run clinical trials and we develop new drugs. It's sort of going to be in the backdrop. It's going to be in the machinery. It's going to make that machinery more efficient. And I suppose if we do this really well, we may also find that we're able to do things that we just wouldn't have happened without it. I mean, that's been the great progress we've seen made in oncology, and treatments that only became enabled through scientific and technological breakthroughs. And maybe, who knows, AI will lead to open up paths that wouldn't otherwise have been opened up. Or at least opened up in our lifetimes rather than our children's lifetimes, if you see what I mean. So look, I'm really confident that this is going to be something which energizes what we do. I'm optimistic about the future. There are things we need to be careful about, but I think we've put the precautionary steps in place. And I hope patients quite quickly start to see some of the benefits, even if they don't know it's because of AI. But nonetheless, they see those benefits.
Yeah. Well, we're on quite a journey, but it's exciting. This has been great. I can't keep you guys here all day, unfortunately. You do have day jobs that I should let you get back to. But this was a really great conversation. I want to thank you both again for joining me. I have a feeling, Stephen, at this rate, you'll be back for every season. And Tala, you too, But again, thank you both so much. This has been fabulous. And I guess we'll see everyone else in another episode of GCP.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks so much for tuning into today's episode. Be sure to join me back here next Tuesday when I'm sitting down with Nicole Stansbury from Premier Research and Maddie Whitehead from Roche to talk about ICH E6R3.